What is the most unexplained, supernatural, or paranormal event you've ever witnessed? I was annoyed with my daughter because she hadn't cleaned her room in weeks, so when I walked by her room and saw her standing there, I assumed she was doing what I said. A few minutes later, she walked out of the shower in the bathroom with a towel wrapped around her and asked why I was looking at her strangely. When I asked her who was in her room, she looked scared, too. I never figured out who that was, but they didn't clean up the room either. Was spending the night at a friend's house as a kid, around 12 to 13. Parents weren't home, so we decided to go out, do some ding-dong ditching, get into some young angsty debauchery. We get home, and it's around 1 or 2 in the morning. Fewer ringing of the doorbell. Naturally we think it's the cops or a pissed-off neighbor. My friend had a small window that looked out onto the front porch that you couldn't really see into from outside. So we took a peek at who was calling at such a late hour. Standing at the door was an old woman in a dress and a young boy in a weird Noosie outfit. Both were dressed extremely out of period, as this was the 90s. And my friend had never seen either in the neighborhood before. We ducked because we were a bit freaked. Look again no less than 10 seconds later and they're both gone. Nobody on the street walking away. No cars driving away. They were just gone without a trace. We did not sleep well. Monday I started to worry about my grandpa. The moment of worry passed. And I went about my day. Later on I posted an article about automated lawn mowers, saying that my grandpa would love this, since taking care of his yard was his hobby. Literally right after I hit share, my dad calls me. We all know this feeling. It's that drop in your stomach when you know something terrible has happened. Or it's about to. The feeling that your world has changed and there's nothing you can do. Anyways, he tells me that my grandpa was rushed to the hospital with a bladder infection followed by several heart attacks, but he's still alive. I didn't think anything about worrying earlier, at least until I woke up the next morning. My dream that night was what made it click in my head, I guess. In the dream I was sitting in my grandpa's shed watching something. And he sits down next to me. Without any pretense he starts talking. The next few weeks are gonna be hard. And they will test you. Don't worry about me. In a few hours I won't have any use for it. We ended up spending what seemed like hours talking about a lot of personal things. Things I honestly didn't know or didn't remember about my grandpa. Most of which my dad and his brother have confirmed to be true. Although a little exaggerated apparently. Grandpa didn't die until around noon on Tuesday. Pretty much just a few hours, 3-hour time difference after my dream. I'm not religious. Nor will I be. But for fuck's sake. What the fuck? I know the subconscious mind can do things like this. But some of the details he told me about his life are things I wasn't there for. Or even alive for. When I was around 6 or 7 we had a cat that had kittens. We knew it had kittens because it was pregnant and then it wasn't anymore. The problem was that we had no idea where the kittens were. I was wondering about it and looked right at the cat and sort of thought in my mind, where are your kittens? But without using words, if that makes any sense. Immediately the location came into my mind. It was through some broken boards just above our porch that our cat could jump into from pillars on the side of the porch. I knew that they were there. I walked straight over there, climbed onto the stone pillar and looked through the hole in the boards. The kittens were right there. I've never had a similar experience again in my life. I'm late to this thread, but reading some of these has compelled me to post. This isn't my story but my mom's. She is an extremely rational person, but this event caused her to have such severe panic attacks that she had to return and live with her parents for 6 months. All of this happened a few years before I was born. My mom's first husband was a Navy pilot during the Gulf War. The carrier was about 10 days into its cruise and operating with complete radio silence. She hadn't heard anything from the ship since it left, but that was to be expected. This was a war. On that night, about 10 days into the cruise, my mom woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. She saw her husband standing in the room. It wasn't an ethereal form either. He appeared solid and utterly the same. The only thing different about him was that his head was shaved. He only had one thing to say. Goodbye. This whole experience startled my mom and she couldn't get back to sleep. She went to the kitchen to get some water when the doorbell rang. All military wives know what the late night doorbell means. Her husband had suffered a massive heart attack and died aboard the carrier. She was grief-ridden, but reasoned that the apparition had been a hallucination born of the stress of having a spouse deployed. Besides, with his head shaved, he didn't even look that familiar. Her mother and mother-in-law flew out immediately to plan for the funeral and receive the body. She stayed strong until the first viewing of the body. Her lifeless husband was bald. In the letter from his NFO, the shaved head was explained as the result of a lost bet. There had been no way of knowing that his head had been shaved, and my mom suffered a minor mental break. My dad died in a house fire in 1991. I was home at the time, on the other side of the house from him. He was sleeping at the time. When I tried to wake him to get him out of the house by breaking a window and trying to jump into his room, I heard him say something. But I don't know what. I never told anyone in the family that he woke up. And the firefighters, doctors or whoever, I really don't remember, said he never did wake up. He didn't die immediately. It was 3 days later. Of smoke inhalation. A few days after he died. My sister told me she had a dream where he wanted her to let me know that he was telling me to get away from the house. I've still never told her he woke up. Edit to answer the questions asked. Some details re-UPM me your Marxism S questions 1. The part of the house where I was a converted garage. And I was goofing around on a new Super Nintendo I had just gotten. So I didn't notice anything for a while. Until it had started to get out of hand. Also, no fire alarms. When I heard the noise of the fire, I had no idea what it was and opened the door from the family room, former garage, into the kitchen. And there was fire everywhere. So first I made sure to get my grandmother, her dog, and my friend out. As an aside, and this is where things get absurd. A friend was visiting to play the fancy new Super Nintendo. He had also recently broken his leg in a motorcycle accident. So he had to hop across the lawn when he left. After I got them out. As I remember it. I tried going around the back from the garage to the porch. To get in the dining room. No good. Fire smoke. Then further down the porch. To get in the bathroom, couldn't reach that window. Then I went back around to the front door. Locked. We never used it. Always went in and out through the converted garage. Then finally to my dad's room. Where I tried to jump in. And got myself knocked back by the smoke. I believe I yelled first. Waking him up. 2. This leads to 2. He wouldn't have had his door locked. But would have had it closed. But then when I woke him I suppose he tried to go out of his room. Which is why there would have been smoke knocking me back out the window. And he was a deep sleeper. So I can imagine he was already confused before he opened the door to the hall. Letting in the smoke heat. And then to Ublinjetichester's follow-up. I was already 20 at the time. Back on winter break from college. So his child. But not a child. If you see what I mean. And unfortunately. Yes. It's true. These days. 20 plus years on. Most of the shock. Anger. And all that stuff has faded. Mostly what gets me upset now is when I sit back and think about how much I would have wanted him to meet my children and they him. I have a very strong danger sense that's been proven terrifyingly correct both times I've had it. The first was when I was in high school training for cross country. I would usually run by this lake near my house. But one day I was close and got a very strong no feeling. It was like fighting against a very strong animal instinct to go any closer. I turned right around and went back to my house. When my mom commented on how short my run was, I explained to her what happened and she seemed alarmed, wondering if I'd had some sort of panic attack. A few days later, police found a body in the lake. The more recent example was when I was riding the DC Metro with my partner sometime last year. We were on the Orange Line and needed to get off at a stop that was also on the Silver Line. We're on the train when all of a sudden I get this very strong sense again. I told my partner about it and though at first he was skeptical, he trusted me and we switched lines. Later we found out there was a stabbing on the Orange Line that same night. Not me but my twin brother. We were around 6 years old. And in Central Australia with our dad and older brother. We were doing some nature walk and he fell back a bit. He then screams and runs and catches up. He told my dad he had seen something. Later that day we were in the town nearby and my twin pointed at a painting in an art gallery and said that the figure in it was what he had seen. My dad went into the gallery and asked the person at the counter what the figure in the painting was. And they said it is an aboriginal spirit that takes children who wander too far from the camper family. I was watching my parents' dog while they were out of town. My sister passed away in their house about a year prior. While I was there, I witnessed a picture of her fall off the wall. Then I discovered that every picture of her in the house had fallen off the wall. Seemingly at the same time. They didn't keep many pictures up in general. So it was only 4 different pictures. I chalked it up to something shaking the house. Even though we live in Ohio and I felt nothing. I went home to my apartment. Face up on my desk was a picture of my sister and me that I knew I had packed away. I don't believe in things like this, but this occurred at a time where I was still very much actively grieving the loss of my sister and it hit me hard. Still can't explain it. My mom passed when I was 7. Flash forward to middle school. We were at this band clinic thing at my mom's old high school. Each school prepared their own piece with their bands. And then we all got the same piece to do together, if that makes sense. Anyways. We were waiting around to get back on stage to play with everyone and were just chatting away as a group. I looked over and at the back of the room was a woman who looked identical to my mom. Same red hair. Glasses, height. Everything. I caught her looking at me a few times and smiling at me. Turned to tell some friends about it, and by the time I looked back, she was gone and I didn't see her after that. Also, I graduated with a French award from high school. I did my walk across the stage, obligatory photo with my department head, who I'm close with, looking out at the crowd. 3 rows behind my dad. Stepmom and aunt. I saw the same lady from before. Super eerie but also kinda nice. When I was young, probably around 8 to 10. I caught chicken pox. I woke up in the middle of the night one night and called for my mom because little kids can't do shit for themselves when they're sick. The woman came into my bedroom and sat on my bed and stroked my hair until I fell asleep. For whatever reason, I thought it was my grandmother, but she was dressed funny. When I woke up the next morning, I went downstairs for breakfast and asked where my grandma was. And, naturally, my mom told me that she was at her house. Like she always was. I told my mom she'd been in my room the night before. And my mom laughed and said that I'd just been dreaming. However, my aunt, who tended to believe that sort of thing more, was babysitting me that day. The upside to chicken pox meant there was no school for me, and I told her the story. She asked me to describe the weird outfit. And it was a nurse's outfit from the 50s, early 60s. My family knew the previous owners of the house. The wife was a nurse in the 50s and had died a few months previously. Can I say with 100% certainty that I had an encounter with a spirit? No. But it's certainly a spooky coincidence. Making toast late one night, facing the kitchen bench, eating for a good 5 to 10 minutes. Cleaned up and turned around and every single cupboard door and cutlery drawer were open. They were all closed when I went into the kitchen. And there was no way anyone could have snuck in and done it because I was home alone. I also didn't hear them open in the time I was there. Scared the shit out of me, so I froze, let it register for a few seconds. Then calmly closed everything and went back to my room to hide until daylight. One of a few weird things to happen growing up. Another time, my brother kept having chronic nightmares for weeks, to the point where he didn't want to sleep in his bed anymore. They were recurring dreams of an old woman who would always be shrouded in shadow and try get at my brother. One night I decided to sleep in that bed and had one of the freakiest dreams I've ever had. The woman my brother had been having nightmares about slid up through the gap between the wall and the bed and was trying to grab and pull me off the bed. Woke up sweating and yelling. It was after this that my mother decided to look into it. The nightmares started a week or so after buying the mattress second-hand. And my mother found out that one of the previous owners was an old woman who had apparently died on the mattress. Safe to say we go it the fuck out of the house, because that shit was way too spooky for my family. We should have burnt it. When I was a child, 10 years old. We lived on the north shore of the Shuswap Lake in BC. It was, then, very rural, with a population of 400 spread out over 10 miles of beachfront with farms up in the hills. No town. Just a store. The post office and an old Indian trail that wound through the forest for perhaps a half-mile near where I lived. We played on the trail all the time. One afternoon, my family, mother, father, brother, myself and a friend went for a walk along the trail. My friend and I ran ahead at one point, out of sight of everyone. We stopped and were looking around, and off in the forest was a man. Slumped over a fallen, rotting log with chickens pecking around him. I can still feel. And I'm talking 50 years in my past. The adrenaline blasting up my back as the figure lifted its head and looked at us with empty, pecked-out eyes. We screamed as both of us saw it and ran back to the adults. When my parents came to the spot with us, only the rotting log was there. To this day, I would not dare walk that path by myself. Somewhere out in the mountains near Mammoth, California, as a kid, my dad, myself, and a few family friends were out gazing at the stars. Being as I was from Law, I think it was the first time I'd ever seen the stars without light pollution. So I was fascinated. I pointed out to a cluster of 3 stars and said, "Hey, look. It's Orion's belt." My father corrected me and showed me that Orion's belt was elsewhere. So I asked, "Well, what constellation is it then?" And pointed back to the one from before. He conceded that it did look very similar to Orion's belt, but that he couldn't tell what it actually was. A little while later, what appeared to be the middle star of the 3 started moving, quickly. It zigzagged through the sky for several seconds before its brightness intensified, and then just like that it disappeared. To this day, the only thing I can think of that it could possibly be was some kind of experimental drone. But this was in the early 90s. And I'm not sure drones existed back then. And if it was a drone, it must have been a damned advanced one, because it stood still for long enough that myself and several adults nearby all thought it was a star. Anyway, kinda boring story, I guess, but that's the only thing I've ever seen in my life that I really can't explain scientifically.